What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 wide receivers that I like for week 9 of the fantasy football season and 3 wide receivers that I don't necessarily like for fantasy football. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into this video and let's start talking about the guys that I like first. So the first wide receiver that I like that I'm going to be starting in my fantasy football leagues this week is going to be Chris Olave, wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints. And Chris Olave, he gets a matchup here against the Chicago Bears, and they will be playing at home in this matchup. I think Chris Olave is a top 12 fantasy football wide receiver for you this week, and that means I think he's going to be a low-end wide receiver 1. Now, if we look at his finishes on the year, he's had 1 finish as a wide receiver 1 so far this year. That was week 1 versus the Tennessee Titans, where he finished as the wide receiver 10, and since then, he has never finished inside of the top 12 again the remainder of the season. The thing I like about Chris Olave is the volume. It's hard to argue the volume. He has 77 targets in his last 8 games. Each of these games, he's getting 10, 11, 15 targets in some of these matchups. So it's hard to argue the volume. The good thing about this matchup against the Chicago Bears is that the Chicago Bears are giving up the 3rd most points to the fantasy football quarterback position. So we should have a better game from Derek Carr in this matchup, which should translate to a better game from Chris Olave. So like I said, he is a top 12 option in my book so far this week. And I think this is going to be the week again where he finishes as a wide receiver 1 for your fantasy football team. Now, the second wide receiver that I like in this matchup this week is going to be Mike Evans, and he gets to play on the road at the Houston Texans here in this one. And I know the Houston Texans have actually been pretty good against fantasy football wide receivers. They've been a very tough matchup, but that has been primarily against the slot. And the good thing for Mike Evans is he doesn't play the slot. That's primarily Chris Godwin's role. So we shouldn't have as tough of a matchup as it looks like on paper for Mike Evans here in this matchup. Now, when we look at the story of Mike Evans in 2023, it's been kind of boom bust for him. We have 3 finishes in the top 13 wide receivers in PPR leagues, and then 3 finishes outside of the top 13. And some of those finishes being like wide receiver 54, wide receiver 43, wide receiver 33 last week against the Buffalo Bills. And so it hasn't been the most consistent year from Mike Evans so far this year. But the reality is he's still scoring a lot of fantasy football points for your teams. In those matchups where he's finished outside of the top 13, he had 17 points. He even had 12.9 points last week. So it's not like he's sinking your teams when he doesn't finish inside of that top 13, but he has been boom or bust. So this week, I think against the Houston Texans, there's a good chance that Mike Evans getting a touchdown. I do think that Mike Evans is going to have a good week for you this week, and I'm viewing him as a top 16 fantasy football wide receiver this week, which means that I think he is going to be a upper tier, maybe a mid-range wide receiver 2 for your fantasy football leagues here in week 9 against the Houston Texans. And last but not least, the third player that I'm going to be starting in my fantasy football leagues this week is going to be Diontae Johnson here on Thursday Night Football versus the Tennessee Titans. And when we look at what the Titans have been giving up to the fantasy football wide receivers so far this year, they are the 7th easiest matchup against wide receivers, giving up about 31.7 points per game to that position. So I do think this is a very, very good matchup for Diontae Johnson here in this matchup. And when we look at what Diontae Johnson has done since getting back in the lineup, because as you guys remember, he missed some time here with an injury earlier in the year, basically missed weeks 2 through week 6 of their bye. But since joining the team again in week 7, he saw 6 targets in week 7 for 79 yards. And then last week, he got 14 targets, which is what we are accustomed to seeing from Diontae Johnson. We know that he is a target monster when it comes to fantasy football, and he had those 14 targets for 85 yards. So in this matchup, I do expect Diontae Johnson to get similar work. Like I said, this Tennessee Titans team has been bleeding points to the fantasy football wide receiver position. He has had 2 top 24 finishes since coming back into the lineup. And so with all of that being said, I think he is a top 24 option for your wide receiver position on your fantasy football teams here in week 9. And I think you can have him as a wide receiver 2 with some upside in this matchup against the Tennessee Titans. And so now that we've talked about 3 players that I like this week, let's talk about 3 players that I would consider sitting because I think they have risky matchups. And we're going to be starting with Hollywood Brown for the Arizona Cardinals, and he gets to play against the Cleveland Browns on the road. And I have Hollywood Brown currently outside of my top 30 wide receivers on the week. So to me, he is a wide receiver 3, maybe a flex option for your fantasy football teams. But I just don't like the matchup because when we look at what the Cleveland Browns have been doing against each of the positions for fantasy football, they've been very tough against the quarterback position. They've been tough against the wide receiver position. They've been tough against the tight end position. Hell, they've even been tough against the kicker position. And it's just that this Browns team has been limiting the opposing teams to very minimal points in each of these matchups. They've been very low scoring games. And so I don't necessarily like this matchup for Hollywood Brown. And we also have to consider that they are going to be starting, or at least it's being reported that they're going to be starting Clayton Tune in this matchup. matchup. So they move away from Joshua Dobbs. They go to Clayton Tune. That kind of throws some unknown into this play this week for Hollywood Brown. If it was Kyler Murray, this would be a different story for me, but it's not Kyler Murray so far this week. At least that's not what it's looking like. So with Clayton Tune under center and this matchup against the Cleveland Browns, Hollywood Brown is going to be sitting outside of my top 30 wide receivers on the week, and he's somebody that maybe you can only flex him, but if you don't really need him, he's somebody that I think you could steer away from this week. Now, the second wide receiver that I'm going to be avoiding in my lineups this week is going to be Tyler Lockett for the Seattle Seahawks, and he plays on the road at the Baltimore Ravens in this matchup, and I currently also have Tyler Lockett outside of my top 30 wide receivers on the week. When we look at the matchup against Baltimore, they are the #1 toughest matchup against fantasy football quarterbacks, so we're expecting a bad week out of Geno. They're also very tough against the wide receiver position, so it should be rough for DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Tyler Lockett. And speaking of Jackson Smith-Njigba, we've seen him kind of step up over the last couple weeks. He hasn't fully broken out for fantasy football by any means. It's not like he's overtaking Tyler Lockett in this offense yet, but it does seem like he's starting to get more involved. And when we look at what Tyler Lockett has done so far this year, he's had a couple really good finishes for us in fantasy football. He's had a 26-point week, a 15-point week, a 22-point week, so he has that high-end upside. The only issue with those weeks is those are the weeks that Tyler Lockett is falling into the end zone. So he's getting touchdowns on those weeks that he's good for you. In the weeks that he's not good for you, and when I say he's not being good for you, he is scoring 3 points, 6 points. He's finishing as like wide receiver 91 on the week in week 1. That is when he's not catching touchdowns. So I think this week is going to be a tougher week for Tyler Lockett. Like I said, tough matchup for Geno, tough matchup for the wide receivers. So I do think that we are going to get a little bit of a disappointing performance from Tyler Lockett this week. And like I said, he's outside of my top 30, and I think he's going to be a wide receiver 3/flex for you this week. And there are going to be other options that I would play over him in this matchup. And now the third and final player that I'm going to be avoiding in my lineups this week and consider sitting is going to be Joshua Palmer for the Los Angeles Chargers. And he's going to be playing on the road at the New York Jets and is currently sitting outside of my top 30 wide receivers as well. Again, a wide receiver 3 or a flex option for your fantasy football teams with minimal upside in this matchup. And when we look at what the Jets have done against fantasy football wide receivers this year, it has been a masterclass. They are the 32nd ranked defense, which means they are the #1 toughest ranked defense against fantasy football wide receivers. They're only allowing 16.5 fantasy points per game to that wide receiver position. They play slow. It's a good defense. Overall, it's been a recipe for disaster for fantasy football wide receivers. And when we look at what Joshua Palmer has done in the absence of Mike Williams and Quentin Johnston not really kind of breaking out yet, but he did look a little bit better last week, by the way. But without him breaking out, it does look like Joshua Palmer is very hit or miss. Wide receiver 35, wide receiver 38, wide receiver 10 in week 7 against the Kansas City Chiefs, and then wide receiver 76 last week. I just don't expect a big week out of Joshua Palmer. I know he can catch a touchdown in this one and possibly save his day and make it look like it's a bad take here, but I think he has very, very minimal upside in this matchup. It is a terrible matchup for him as far as the defense goes, and overall, I just don't see this being a matchup where I'm going to be seeking out Joshua Palmer in my fantasy football lineups, and so because of that, I'm going to be avoiding him again outside of my top 30 and maybe just a flex play for you this week. And with all of that being said, I've found 3 plays over on Underdog Fantasy that I will be taking, including these players that we've talked about today. If you like these plays, go ahead and feel free to tail them and follow them over there over on Underdog Fantasy. But we have Diontae Johnson over 5 receptions. We have Chris Olave higher than that 60.5 receiving yards, and then Mike Evans higher than that 52.5 receiving yards as well. And like I said, if you want to follow these plays, tail these plays, 3 out of 3 will give you 6 times your entry. So $10 could turn into $60 if we get all 3 of these right today. And you can sign up over on Underdog Fantasy. Like I said, use code League FFB when you sign up. They will give you a 100% deposit match, and they will even give you a free mystery pick'em, which is like Brock Purdy over half a yard passing that you can add on to this just to get the winnings even higher on that play. So again, if you want to follow these plays, go ahead and take these plays here that you see on the screen. But with all of that being said, I don't have anything else for you guys today. So make sure that you hit that like button. It is the best free way to show our channel some support. Make sure you're hitting that subscribe button if you want more videos like this, and also go join our free Discord. It is going to be linked in the description, and that's where you guys can reach out to me any day, any time of the day, and I will be able to get you any type of fantasy football advice you need. I will see you guys on the next video, but until then, peace out.